Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay and you're watching Linsca Adventure, and today we are adventuring through another Bible story as we do every single Friday. So today we're going to be talking about the story of David, especially the first half of his life as he was heading towards becoming the king. So a little bit of backstory why I'm talking about this particular story this week. I love the story of David. Although I was hesitating for the past few weeks to even consider bringing him up in one of these videos because I feel like he's talked about a lot in churches. Like we see his story is like a major part of the Bible actually. Like we see it in 1 Samuel chapters 16 to 31, and that's kind of the area we'll be staying in today. But we also see it in all of 2 Samuel, you know, 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, all of 1 Chronicles, and a whole bunch of the Psalms. So he's like in a lot of the Bible, and fair enough, he was a pretty great guy. And, you know, consequently, a lot of people talk about him, and I was like, ugh, I don't know if I really want to add to this. But, you know, when God calls you, that's what you do. So I have been enjoying one of my favorite novels this past week that's actually written about King David and really culturally contextual and, you know, really brings out what the Bible is talking about. A lot of historical research has gone into it, and it's just like you get immersed into the culture and the times in these books. And so I've been reading that in my downtime and just being like immersed in that. And then at the same time, I also do Bible studies with some kids at my church. So I do Bible studies with kids between the ages of 4 and 14. And at the moment, I have a 14-year-old girl who asks some really big questions. Like all my kids ask big questions. I encourage them to ask the questions that they're interested in. And we sort of build the Bible study around answering that question. But this girl, she's got like a whole bunch of questions, and sometimes we go back and revisit what they are. And a bit about her. She recently had an experience with God, had a dream where she saw, you know, Jesus calling to her, and that's about it as far as I've heard so far. So she knows that God is calling her, but her question that really stuck with me this week was, how do you know what God is calling you to do? She knows that God is calling her at all, but she doesn't know like what the plan is, like where her life is heading towards, like what kind of job she's going to have, those kind of things. And so we kind of unpacked this question a bit. And with the context of having been, you know, immersed in the story of David in the back of my mind, it kind of all came together quite nicely. And I'd like to share kind of the answer that I gave to her and unpack it a bit more for you guys. So before I give you the answer, let's just look at David's life and go from there. So we're, like I said a minute ago, we're looking at mostly the stories that are found in 1 Samuel chapter 16 to 31. That whole time period between when David was anointed king and when he actually became king, and sort of what was going on in that process. So David was around about 15 years old when he was anointed. We don't know exactly when because, little fun fact, people back in the Bible times did not care about numbers or dates or any of these things that we're so obsessed with in our modern scientific-minded kind of Western world. We love numbers. We love knowing exactly what's going on down to like the subatomic level, if possible. You know, just down to the fraction of the second, all these kind of things. But people back then, they were like, it was around about that time. Some king was in charge, and it was probably like the second year of his reign, probably about halfway through, something like that. Like they just didn't care about numbers. So they actually didn't ever record how old David was, even though we'd love to know. And so from piecing together the bits of information that we do have, we can guess he was around about 15, no more than 18 years old probably when he was anointed king. Yeah, so he was 15 years old-ish when he was anointed, but then we know for certain, because they said it, that he was 30 years old when he began to reign in Judah. And there was another 7 years before he started reigning all of Israel. Fun fact, he lived to be about 70 years old. And when he started reigning in Judah, he was 30, and he reigned for another 40 years. So the time that he was actually king was 10 years longer than the first half of his life where he wasn't king. So that's, I think, important to keep in note as we go along. Keep note of in the back of your mind as we go along. So what was actually happening between the age of 15 and 30? Like, there's about 15 years there. What was going on while, God had already said, this is going to be the next king, and then it took all this period of time for him to become the king? Why did it have to take 15 odd years? Why couldn't it have just gone, today I'm saying you're the king, tomorrow you are the king, or today I'm saying you're the king, and today you're the king? Like, why wasn't it that quick? What was going on? What needed to happen? So from what I've been reading, from what I've been immersing myself in, there were a few things that I realized that David actually had to learn along the way before he could fully step into his role as king. If you remember the talk that we did about Joseph and his early life, how he had that 13 years of humility training before he could become the prime minister, spoiler alert, it's kind of a little bit like that, what we're talking about today. So a few things that I see that he learnt in those 15 years. He learnt warfare and how to lead warriors. So basically, as soon as he was anointed, a little bit afterwards he killed Goliath, and right after that he was put in charge of the army. And so all of a sudden he's gone from this shepherd to this guy who's now leading people around with swords and trying to chop people's heads off, basically. So that doesn't really fit together in my mind if we just look at it from our current cultural perspective. Like, there's a guy who's just sitting around with sheep all day long, like, watching them munch and finding them a new grassy patch at the end of the day or something. And then all of a sudden he's in this position where he's, leading men how to fight and not get killed in the process, ideally. So there was warfare, then there was also wisdom. We see a few times, I think it's like in chapter 17-ish. I didn't write it down. So 1 Samuel, around about 17, 18 probably. It says a few times that wherever David went, he acted wisely. He acted with wisdom. And so wherever he went, so the king would have sent him out. It says wherever the king sent him, and so wherever he was sent, he was probably like in a representative kind of position. So not only was he a guy who was leading the armies, but he was also considered like a personal representative of the king. He was very close to the king, especially because of his position as, soothing the king in his madness, in his demonic, episodes, whatever was going on. He was there playing the harp, and he was soothing him, and so he was always in the king's presence, and he was always just surrounded by the court, what was going on at the highest level of society in Israel at the time. And he was just observing, taking it all in, and allowing it to mold him and teach him all the lessons of how he was going to become king eventually and how he would have to behave. And so there's that wisdom in how to deal with political situations within the country of Israel, with all the elders and heads of all the different tribes and stuff like that. And then he also had this very, very close friendship with Jonathan, the crown prince. So Jonathan was expected by basically everyone to be the next guy to be king. So there was Saul, and then Jonathan is the oldest son. He was expected to just take over that position and basically begin this dynasty of Saul's family. So when it says the soul of Jonathan was knit to David's, and they were like best friends, basically. Because they were so close, And because we can deduce pretty easily that Jonathan knew that David was going to become the king, like that was what God had called him to. He was in the only position, like he was the only person who to be in this position where he could actually mentor David in the ways that he needed to learn and grow. You know, he's from this little tiny dinky town in Judah where all they have is sheep and fields, and now he's thrown into the highest part of society. And he probably doesn't know how to behave. You know, he's just completely a fish out of water and all this kind of stuff. But Jonathan's like, all right, I'm going to mentor you. And Jonathan could have been about 20 years older than David. A lot of people think they were close in age because they're friends. However, if you do the maths from various, you know, points of reference in the book of 1 Samuel, you can see that they're at least 10 to 20 years apart in age. So yeah, there's this older guy who is best friends with David, and he's also in this political position where he's learning how to behave himself because there's not been any princes before him. So he's kind of the first prince. His dad is the king and he's the prince, and now he's kind of gone through, paved the way. This is how we behave as a royal family, and let me bring my best friend into that and teach him how to behave as well. So yeah, Jonathan would have been able to teach him about the expectations and responsibility of the role of king and of rulership in general. Also, David ended up getting married to Michal, the daughter of Saul, sister of Jonathan. And this marriage would have solidified him in the minds of the people in general as a possible heir to the throne. And I think this is where Saul started putting the pieces together, going, oh dear, what have I done? You know, I've just made his hold on the throne a lot easier should he wish to take it from me. But yeah, so God brought him through to this point where he ended up marrying into the family, into the royal family. And if you're married into the royal family of any country back in those days, then that meant you had a much greater claim to, you know, receiving the throne should something happen to the first guys in line. So there was like Jonathan, and then he had like 3 younger brothers. And I think Saul had a concubine, so there was a few like half brothers in there who were like not quite considered princes, but sort of. But yeah, they weren't really in line for the throne. But basically, David was pretty high up there in his opportunity to inherit the throne should anything happen to the older brothers. So yeah, that's another part that God brought him through. Also, he had a lot of military victories and constant contact with the various people across Israel in this representative role, like I already touched on. But because of his military victories, you know, they sang that song, and it becomes kind of like a trope, actually, as you read through, where the ladies in town are welcoming him back and saying, you know, Saul has slain his thousands, but David's slain 10,000. And, you know, Saul gets very angry about that. But then that line gets repeated a few times. Like the Philistines know about it, and they're like, isn't this guy who's, you know, slain 10,000s of us? Like, get rid of him. And they say that a couple of times down the line. And it's like the slogan that's attached to David. It's what he's known for. He's known for his military prowess. Yeah, so in that sense, you know, one of the major reasons why the Israelites even wanted a king was for military protection from the peoples around them. And so as time goes on, when Saul is out of the picture, because he died on, you know, the mountain of Gilboa, the people are discussing, you know, do we go with Abner and Saul's son, Eshbaal, or do we go with David, who is actually very well known for his, you know, military ability and his ability to protect us from, you know, the kingdoms of Moab and Ammon and Philistia and the kingdoms to the north and the kingdoms to the south, you know, all of these different places that were a threat and everyone wants to get into these highlands that are like really good, you know, place to be, fortress wise and tactically, you know, for warfare and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the minds of the people who just live in Israel, and the elders and what they need from a leader. And a major thing that they want and need from a leader is somebody to protect them. So when David proves that he can protect and people are singing about him, yeah, it's pretty clear that he's got a good hold on his future throne in that way as well. So, that's kind of the things that he would have learnt in his time living in the palace, just as a random guy who ended up there as a musician and then as son-in-law to the king and as this military guy. But then when this gets too much for Saul and he wants to keep killing David, trying to spear him and all these different things, he ends up getting to the point where David runs away. And he runs off initially to the place where Samuel the prophet lived. And then after that, he went over to Philistia to hide over there. And then he ran away from there and ended up just living as an exile in the land of Judah, in Israel and Judah. And while he's there, he's collecting all of these men who are coming to him, and it says that they were just discontent or they were in debt, or, you know, there were all these people who you wouldn't want to associate with. Like, there probably were murderers and thieves and all these people who were just probably low lives, and some people who were just outcast because they were different, or, you know, anyone and everyone who was just at the bottom of the rungs of society were attracted to David, and he had to somehow lead them. And so in his time of persecution, he learned a whole different set of skills and responsibilities that he wouldn't have been able to learn while he was hanging out in the palace all the time like he had been the first few years. So, and by the way, it's estimated that his time running away from Saul was about 10 years. And so in the space of 15 years, he probably spent about 5 years at the start, you know, hanging out in Gibeah, where the palace was, and then about 10 years off in the forests, running around with all these random men who started following him around. So while he was being persecuted by Saul, he had to really fully rely on God's providence and leading. He had to learn some humility, probably. I mean, he was already pretty humble, having come from a shepherd sort of perspective, but I think sometimes there are areas that, you know, we might think that we're pretty humble, but then there's this one thing that we're really good at or, you know, really proud of, and God needs to humble us in that specific area sometimes. I know I've been through that a few times now. God keeps showing me, all right, now that thing we're going to work on. It's always fun. So what I'm pulling out of the things that he learned in his time of persecution might be a little bit harder to see at first glance, but if you really dig into it, I think you can see these things as well. And absolutely go and read it and let me know in the comments what you're finding if you think I've missed anything out. But yeah, so his time of persecution, he learned to fully rely on God's providence and leading, humility, boundaries and honor, how to lead these 400 of the worst that Israel and the surrounding nations had to offer, how to deal with the kings of the surrounding nations like Moab and Philistia. We see him interacting with kings in both of those places. In Philistia, in Gath specifically, he was given a whole town. Like, I wonder what happened in the backstory that we don't know about that. Like, why did this Philistine, you know, leader just give an entire town to somebody who would be considered the enemy by that entire nation? I really wonder what kind of smooth talking happened in that. And then for Moab as well, to take the family and like David's family and look after them for an undetermined period of time at that point, like, I wonder what he did there to convince him to go along with that, because, you know, they're enemies. Even though they do have Moabite blood through his grandmother Ruth, I wonder, what kind of diplomatic conversation that would have been. Yeah, so he's having all of these lessons that he's learning and probably a heap more. Yeah, so in this 15 years, he wasn't sitting around doing nothing, waiting, at his father's house, keeping a sheep or whatever, like he had been on the day that he was anointed. He wasn't just waiting around for 15 years to be given the throne, to be given the crown, to be given the entire country of Israel to lead, and then, build an empire from there, because we know he conquered the other nations around him. Yeah, he wasn't just waiting around. He was actually actively engaged in the process of learning, whether he liked it or not. Like, I bet when he first ran away from Saul and, was spending the next 10 years off in the wilderness or in various different parts of the land of Canaan, like, I don't think he was enjoying most of that. I don't think he was saying, thank you, God, for this, wonderful learning opportunity. Maybe he was saying that in the first 5 years while he was hanging out in Gibeah, like, this is great, like, I'm learning so much good stuff that it's good for, running a kingdom. Maybe he had the foresight to think and pray that. But I have the feeling that, yeah, he wasn't so enthusiastic about the second half of it all. And so I think when God calls us to do something, whether we know exactly what that is or we know that he's just calling us somewhere, there's this whole process that we go through. And this is the answer that I gave to the girl that I was giving Bible studies to the other night. Basically, we don't know always where we're going. We don't know where God's taking us. But we are called to do whatever is in front of us, whatever God's placed in front of us. We are called to do that with diligence and excellence. Like, for this 14-year-old girl, she was just worried about her maths test coming up next week. Like, how's she going to get through that? And that's actually important for her. That is what she's called to do right now, I believe. Like, she's called to be a kid, be a student, have that foundation set where she is, going through her education and doing that as well as she can, learning to be a good child for her parents, learning to become a young woman. And until God gives her further instructions, that's what she's called to do. And if you're in that boat, that's what you're called to do. And if you're a bit older, if you're at uni or beyond there or whatever it is, like, whatever is placed right in front of you right now, whether you know that God's calling you to something much greater or something very different, whatever God's called you to do right now, whatever responsibility that you've been given in life, that's what you're called to. And in the meantime, like, while you're doing that, you are learning valuable skills to, put into practice when you get to that place, whatever that is. Like, I know for me, God's calling me into a specific area of ministry, and I have been on a huge journey. Like, God called me when I was 14 and then confirmed it 9 years later when I was like 23, I think. And now I'm 25, and I think I'm just on the cusp of stepping into that zone of where God's calling me to. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. We don't know the future. But I can see over the past 11 odd years, the journey that God's taken me on, doing mission work multiple times and going through a very roundabout, way of going through my uni course, and all the different places, the different jobs, the different house situations that I've lived in, like, the different things that God's brought me through have taught me so many valuable lessons. And I think, yeah, whatever God calls you to do right now and to do in the future, they're all interconnected, and you can learn valuable lessons from every area of life, yeah, to take with you. So that's all I think I really have to say. I'd just like to ask you, what do you think God has called you to? Where are you on your journey? And what are you learning or have learnt that you can take into the future assignment that God thinks that you think that God has called you to? Oh my goodness, my words today. So leave your comments below. like and subscribe, please. Share this with a friend who you think needs this encouragement. And yeah, I'd love to see you again next week. So that's all for today. Have a good day. I'll see you around. Bye.